Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to enter chapter 2 today. Mark chapter 2, beginning with verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6, contains 5 consecutive vignettes from the life of Jesus, which demonstrate the demise of his relationship with the Jewish authorities, particularly the Pharisees. They are wondering who he is early on, and by the 5th of these episodes, they're plotting to kill him, joining forces, making strange political bedfellows, because although they don't agree on anything else, they agree that Jesus has got to go. I don't know that these events happened one right after the other, as we've already talked about in ancient historiography. You could group events along a theme. In fact, modern historians they continue to do this. Doris Kearns Goodwin did this in Team of Rivals. We think nothing of that. So if Mark does it, he's just doing what many historians have done already and will continue to do. To me, it's like that series of vignettes from The Breakfast Table in Citizen Kane, where he and his wife Kane and his new wife, patrician wife, have breakfast every morning, and it goes from them being loving and devoted to each other to being less interested, to ignoring each other, to open hostility. And we see really the history of their marriage in a series of 4 or 5 breakfast scenes. And we have something very much like that. It just illustrates the great storyteller's craft that's being applied in the Gospel of Mark. In the first episode, Jesus reads their thoughts, and he knows that they're questioning his actions. In the second episode, they talk to his disciples and bring their questions to the disciples. In the third episode, they ask Jesus directly why he's not doing what they think he ought to be doing. In the fourth episode, they openly confront Jesus with hostility and make accusations. And in the fifth episode, they bait Jesus. They're setting him up to do something that they can accuse him of. And they make alliances to destroy Jesus. And so we have this happening in these next 5 episodes, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1. I think before we move on and get into the text, I need to take a couple of minutes to just talk about the different groups we're going to be running into. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, the Herodians, and the Zealots. Palestine is controlled by the Roman Empire. It just is. All the Mediterranean world is controlled by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, in comparison to the empires that went before it, in many ways, even in comparison to the Babylonian Empire, we're enlightened. They identified slaves as persons and gave them certain rights under the law that their masters could not violate, which makes them even more enlightened than our nation for the first century or so of its existence. And they allowed ancient religions to be practiced in the homeland, and they allowed people who were part of those religions to continue to practice those religions wherever they went. Judaism was one of those protected religions. It was a religio licitae. It was a legalized religion. Therefore, Romans in the Jewish homeland of Judea were not allowed to violate Jewish law, or not allowed to as Gentiles. They didn't have to live as Jews, but they weren't allowed to show disrespect. They couldn't bring in busts of Caesar because Caesar was worshipped as a god, and that was considered idolatry. It also meant that Jews around the empire, and they lived all through the empire, Jews around the empire were not compelled to participate in the national religion in any way. Something that benefits Christians for an entire generation before Rome figures out that Christianity and Judaism the same thing. But none of this sat well with people in Judea, particularly, and they wanted the Romans gone. So you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees are a religious movement. They are not a political movement. They are a religious movement, and it's a small movement relatively. There were probably a few thousand actual Pharisees in Palestine, maybe as many as 10, although they had an enormous sway over the people because basically they controlled the synagogues and they had some members on the Sanhedrin. And the Pharisaic movement, we can read about it being born really in the book of Zechariah, when they bring their questions about fasting to Zechariah chapter 7. We just talked about that a few weeks ago, and we'll mention that again. But they were a very conservative, religiously conservative movement. They believed in building a hedge around the law by observing their customs. And they were a learned movement. They prided themselves in scholarship. The great tradition of the rabbis that really began 200 BC or so, the Mishnah, the Talmud, it's all a product of this Pharisaic movement that sought to learn and apply the law, but in a certain way. The Sadducees were the high priestly party. Not all priests or Levites were Sadducees. They probably took their name from the high priest Zadok, which we know from the Old Testament. And they were well educated. They were well off, as many of the Pharisees were well off. And they had an uneasy partnership and friendship with Rome, which we see on display when Caiaphas and his emissaries bring Jesus to Pilate. We see that there's a real tension between the two groups, but there's also a sense of cooperation between the two groups, and there's a tug of war going on, gamesmanship, but they're all playing the same political game. The Romans at this point appoint the high priest, which comes into play when we have both Annas and Caiaphas identified as high priest. The Sanhedrin is the Jewish council. They have limited authority over the Jews, but they have some recognized authority over the Jews, and they were composed of 70 people, some of whom were of the Herodian party, some of whom were of the high priestly party, and some of whom were the Pharisaic party. Then there are the Herodians. This is just the Herod Mafia. The Herodians are the Herod Mafia. We would dignify them by calling them a political party, but they were attached to the family of the Herods, their retainers, their lackeys, and they fought for the interests of the Herods. The Herodians are not Jews. They're intermingled with Jews. They're Idumeans. So they're descended from Edomites and the people that the Edomites bred with following the Babylonian captivity. The Zealots are the party of extreme Hebrew nationalism. They are the nationalist party, and they want the Romans gone. And the most extreme of the Zealots were terrorists. In fact, there was a group associated with the Zealots, perhaps even inside the Zealots, called the Sicarii, the assassins, and these were pure terrorists. They set fire to buildings, they robbed stores of weapons, they assassinated Romans and collaborators with the Romans in the streets. They were very adept at that. They might have been the very first group of trained assassins. They'd sneak up behind someone in the marketplace and take a very small dagger, which the word Sicarii may come from the word for a small dagger, and just stab a guy in the back and then get lost in the crowd. And they were known for that. Well, anyway, these are the ones that we're going to be meeting starting tomorrow and talking about in detail. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 10 good minutes with the Word.